fashion, so I'm allowed my button undone on my collar, but that's helpful to me tonight. I would love you to have a Bible, so if you haven't got one, please do try and grab one. There's a few at the back if you need a copy for yourself. And we are going to be back in Acts, and looking mainly at Acts chapter 25. It was just a couple of weeks ago, I was camping in Dorset. I went with some of the year sixes from our school to a beautiful part of the world down near Swanage Bay. And this is the site. I actually went down on the second day, but this is the site that I was sent through, a beautiful sunrise on the first morning of the year six camp. It looked lovely, idyllic. A great picture on Twitter that people liked from worlds away, saying it looked fantastic. I then arrived the following morning, and this is what we faced for the rest of the week. It was grim. I arrived, the rain arrived, and it stayed for the rest of the week. It was foul. There I was, lying in my tent. We were meant to be glamping. There I was, lying in my tent at 3 o'clock in the morning with the rain hammering down. If you know me, you know I don't sleep a lot anyway. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, I was there thinking, let's go home. The next night, exactly the same, other than there was a great wind as well. Let's go home. Let's give up. Let's give up. Pack it in. A few years ago, we were on YPF holiday, and we went to North Wales, Snowdonia. This is what we were promised. We were going to climb Snowdon as a group. We were in the hands of Major Rob Scothen, 25 to 30 YPFers with him, about to trek to the peak of Snowdon to see the beautiful sights. As we drive into Snowdonia, set foot outside the minibuses, we get this. We could see nothing. There was cloud, there was fog, it was miserable. Major Rob Scothen, on we go, troops! And we cracked on. Some of the YPF in their flip-flops. There came a point on that trek up Mount Snowdon where some of the YPF, and in all honesty, some of the leaders, turned to each other and said, let's give up. Let's pack this in. Let's go. On a similar YPF holiday, again, back in the regions of Snowdonia, some of you men will know this experience all too well. We went to the High Ropes Centre. There was not one good thing about that experience. It was horrible. There I was, 30, 40 feet up from the floor, balancing on a single rope, shaking like a leaf, thinking this rope is not going to hold my weight, not wanting to press on, not wanting to go back. I was stuck. My mind was saying, please give up. Go home. Pack it in. I've had enough. I don't know what it is for you. Maybe it's a DIY project. Maybe it's a jigsaw puzzle, one of those impossible puzzles. Maybe it's a Sudoku or a crossword. Maybe it's a long, dry novel. Maybe it's a long sermon on a hot night. What is it that sometimes makes you just go, let's just give up. I am going nowhere. When you look at our world in a week like this week, maybe your thoughts are like the front page of the Sun newspaper yesterday. Just that one simple word. Why? A senseless week. We try and make sense of a senseless world. Terror. Rampaging in Europe on that beautiful seafront in Nice. Why? We try and understand some of the events going on in Turkey. It doesn't seem to make sense. It seems to be wrong. Some of you may remember a song from the 1990s by a group called the Four Non-Blondes. And there was a line that said, "I scream from the top of my lungs, what's going on?" What is going on? Things are not as they should be. Despair. Feelings of, let's just pack this in. Let's give up. I wonder when you look at your own lives, where you're at right now. I wonder if there are any circumstances in your lives, maybe that health diagnosis that you've just been given, the constant pain that you're battling, the heartbreak of loss, the despair of broken relationship, the worry about straying children, that ongoing nagging feeling of loneliness. What is going on? This isn't how it should be, is it? And what about your Christian faith? Are any of you feeling, it's just too hard? God seems so distant from me. I keep failing and failing and failing and failing. How? Why does God allow such heartbreak? Why is it just so difficult? Everything seems against me. Do you ever feel like just packing in your Christian faith? I do. Well, we come back to our series in the book of Acts tonight. And we come back to look at a man that if anyone ever had the right to feel, let's just pack it in, I give up, it really could have been Paul. Here is Paul, this great apostle, a missionary for God, a man who is giving everything for the advance of the gospel. But in recent weeks in our studies in Acts, we've seen this. We've seen him accused of all sorts, accused of causing uproar in towns. We've seen him stripped, flogged, thrown in jail. We've seen him under mob attack. We've seen him seized at the temple. People have attempted to kill him. He's been carried by soldiers to the barracks. Another plot to kill him. An oath sworn, we do not eat until this man is dead. He's then accused in court of being a troublemaker, stirring up the Jews, a ringleader of a sect, trying to desecrate the temple. He's then put under guard and thrown into prison. As we come to Acts 25, doesn't Paul have the right to say, I give up. I give up. What is going on? Things are not as they should be. I just want to show you three things that Paul faced in a few minutes this evening. And just firstly, please look at Acts chapter 24, the last verse of Acts chapter 24 that I asked Ben to read as part of tonight's reading. It's a verse that can be so easily glossed over. Remember I said three things I'm going to show you about what Paul faced. And here we are. This is where we pick up the story. 27 of chapter 24. When 2 years had passed, Felix, the Roman governor, was succeeded by Porcius Festus. But because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. Just get your head around that. Just read that again. For 2 years, where is Paul? He is simply left in prison. So firstly, Paul is abandoned. He's left alone, cast into a jail, in a sense left to rot. For 2 years, he's awaiting some kind of trial. The last 2 years of Felix's governorship, he is just left. And why? As a favor to the Jews. Just think about the concept of 2 years. Where are we today? Is it 17th of July, 2016? Roll your minds back to 17th of July, 2014. 2 years of your life was just wiped away. What would you have missed? It's really hard to think, isn't it? Something to do with your job, your family, new babies, some relationship. I wonder what's happened in your life. What about this church life? There'd have been some American guy standing here called Bobby. You'd never have heard of Daff. 2 years of your life gone. What about national life or international life? Brexit would not be on the agenda. Leicester winning the Premier League? You're joking. England beating Australia at cricket and at rugby? Woo! A British man in space? A general election, a new Prime Minister? 2 years just left in prison. That's a huge deal, isn't it? Paul is abandoned. He's just left. I wonder if it reminds you of a story from the Old Testament at all. The story of Joseph. There is Joseph, thrown into prison, falsely accused of trying to attack Potiphar's wife. And he's just abandoned, thrown into prison, falsely thrown there. And while he's there, if you remember, he interprets the dreams of the baker and the butler. And do you remember what he says to the butler when he's interpreted his dream? He says, "Remember me to the Pharaoh, so I can get out of prison. Remember me." Genesis 40, it tells us this. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. And the chief cupbearer went, today I'm reminded of my forgetfulness. When 2 full years had passed. Interesting, eh? 2 years Joseph was forgotten about in prison. For 2 years, Paul is abandoned in prison. He's left alone. What is going on? Doesn't seem as though things are as they should be. I wonder if some of you currently feel abandoned, left alone. David Wilkerson wrote a book entitled, "Do You Feel Like Giving Up?" Here is a short extract from his book. He's talking about our Christian lives. Why do we feel like giving up at times? Our prayers seem to be unanswered. We cry out for help in desperation. He seems not to hear. Doubt creeps in, and Satan whispers, "Nothing works. Faith in God doesn't produce results. Quit. Give up." Are there prayers of yours that are seemingly unanswered at the moment? Do you feel alone? Do you feel far from God? This is not what you signed up for as a Christian. What's going on? It's supposed to be different to this, isn't it? But not only is Paul abandoned and left, he's also falsely accused. Have a look at the first few verses of Acts 25. And here we find Festus in verse 1 going up to Jerusalem, where he's confronted by the chief priests and the leaders. And they present their charges against Paul. And then they even try to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem. Why? So they could ambush him and kill him on the way. In verse 6, a court is convened in Caesarea. And look at verse 7. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood round him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. He's falsely accused. Verse 8, Paul says, I have done nothing wrong. There is Paul standing at this convened court, being accused falsely, and Paul defends himself, I've done nothing wrong. Flick on to verse 25. Because here we have Festus, the Roman governor, confirming Paul's words. Verse 25, I found he had done nothing deserving of death. Festus, you know very well. Paul says, you know very well I've done nothing wrong. But he says, if I have, I deserve death. If I have, kill me. But I'm not guilty. And you know it. Paul's accusers are gathered. The vultures are circling. They want their man. So Paul is accused falsely. Things are made up against him to condemn him. What is going on? Things are not as they should be, are they? I wonder how many of you know what it's like to be falsely accused, attacked, victimized, picked on. Maybe your work or your business place has been attacked. Maybe your reputation has been sullied by someone else. Has someone sought to damage you to enhance their own good? To put you down? Do you know the hurt of lies against your character? Someone looking to black mark you. Maybe even lies against your Christian character, trying to expose you. There's a very famous American lawyer, a Harvard law professor called Alan Dershowitz. He spent a career defending the accused. I'd love to read you a few words of his. It's a little bit too long to put on the screen, so please just listen in and bear with me. These are his words. During my half-century career, I thought I had experienced every aspect of the justice system. Some of my clients have been falsely accused. I thought I understood what it must feel like to be falsely accused. As a child, I read the biblical story of Joseph, who was falsely accused of attempting to rape Potiphar's wife. I recall wondering what it must have been like for Joseph to be in prison, knowing he'd done nothing wrong. But until it happened to me, I would have no real comprehension of what it actually feels like. My education is now complete. I understand. He actually stood accused of an improper sexual relationship with an underage woman, accused by a lady with a history of false accusations. He goes on and says everyone knew her story was made up. No one would believe the lie, surely. My wife was less certain. You trust the truth too much, she said. Why do you think people will believe the truth? She turned out to be right in part. Many who didn't actually believe the accusation wanted to believe it. They hoped it was true. He says, you can't unring a bell. Has your reputation been damaged by falsehood? Things aren't as they should be. Should Paul just give up? He's abandoned. He's falsely accused. And then thirdly, we see him judged by human hands, condemned by human hands. Paul, this servant of the living God, his fate seems to lie in the hands of fallen, sinful men and women who are far more concerned with their own welfare and their own reputation. At the end of chapter 24, Governor Felix seemed to hold the keys to freedom for Paul. But he was more worried about a bribe than the truth. Then have a look at verse 9. And here is Festus. I've already said that he offers Paul a trial in Jerusalem. But why? To do the Jews a favor. Paul would suffer and be condemned in Jerusalem. And Festus will now pass Paul on to Rome, but he wants to consult with the appointed Jewish king, this guy called Agrippa. He wants to talk to him first. And Festus explains to Agrippa, please look at verse 24, later on in the chapter. Verse 24, Festus speaks to Agrippa. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting he ought not to live any longer. I found he had done nothing deserving of death. Well, let him go then. But because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Well, let him go then. Therefore, I've brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. Paul's fate seems to be in the hands of mere men. Yeah, governors and kings, but this is not as it's supposed to be for God's servant, is it? Interestingly, King Agrippa is a descendant of King Herod the Great, the king from the time of Jesus. This is a Jewish king who is answerable to the Romans. And again, if you look in verse 23, you'll see that Festus, when he brings Paul before Agrippa, we get this phrase here. It says, the next day Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp. And they entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul is brought in. The bigwigs are there. Those who thought they were a big deal, in human terms, are there. They're judging over Paul. They're presiding his fate. The whole concept of pomp and ceremony, if you think about our British royal family, that well sums up pomp and ceremony. The Brits do it really well. The fanfare, the red carpet, the military regalia. These groups must be special, mustn't they? Agrippa and Bernice are portrayed as this glorious king and queen who Paul is brought before. But the reality is very, very different. Agrippa and Bernice have a very checkered history and a very interesting private life. Bernice had been married twice before, once to her own uncle, with whom she had 2 sons. She was then a mistress to another man. And now she is seen everywhere with Agrippa. Agrippa was her own brother. There are rumors circulating throughout the empire of an incestuous relationship between the two. They tried to cover it up with her becoming a mistress elsewhere, but they were brought back together and the rumors persisted. And here they are, presented as this king and queen, brother and sister. Glorious and powerful. Is Paul's fate really in their hands? Here are a group of people who see and recognize Paul's innocence, yet totally unprepared to set him free. Unprepared to do justice. Much more concerned with their own pomp, their own reputation, their own standing. these sinful human beings, they seem to be in control. Maybe in a week like this week, you might look at our world and think, why do the bad guys win? Why do the bad guys seem to be in control? Maybe in your lives you know something of the immoral, the liar, the hypocrite, the cheat, that just seem to do really well. They seem to hold some power over you. Whereas the loyal, the trustworthy, the faithful are frequently crushed. God's truth seems to be pushed to the background. It's actually God and Christianity that seem to be in the dock facing trial, rather than in the judgment seat itself. I wonder if you're desperately trying to live your life in obedience to Jesus Christ. To live a life of morality. To live a life that is pleasing to Him. And yet you're just at that stage where you look at it and think, this is getting me nowhere. I'm not winning. What's going on? It's pretty important we don't finish right there. We don't finish with the, it's not fair, things aren't as they're supposed to be. Because actually we may as well just give up then. Let me just show you one or two things from Paul's story here. Because in some senses, things aren't as they should be. You know that from looking at our world. But in one very real sense, things are exactly as they should be. Things are exactly as they should be. God has not lost control. God has not failed in His plans. Have a look at verse 11, please. At the very end of verse 11, Paul appeals to Rome. I appeal to Caesar. And as a Roman citizen, he has a right to appeal to Rome. But why does he appeal to Rome? For yes, it will get him a fair trial. He knows Jerusalem will not be a fair trial. But far more importantly, why does he appeal to Rome? Because one day he will share the gospel in Rome. A couple of things to flick to. Have a look back in Acts chapter 9, please. Do flick back. Acts chapter 9 and verse 15. This is the story of Paul's or Saul's conversion. Chapter 9, verse 15. And the Lord is speaking to Ananias about Paul. He says this, go. This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. This man is my chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles and their kings. God's plan was that Paul would speak to Felix. He would speak to Festus. He would speak to Agrippa. Because here he is, forgotten, accused, condemned. And yet he's talking before Roman governors and kings. And did you see what he was talking about? Back to Acts chapter 25. Look at verse 19. Festus is talking to Agrippa about Paul, about what's being said. Verse 19. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul claimed was alive. Paul is speaking to kings and rulers about Jesus and about the resurrection of Jesus. Amazing, isn't it? Flick back to Acts chapter 23. One more flick. Acts chapter 23 and verse 11. Paul has just been tried to be killed. And you may remember this from John Tyndall's sermon, these great words from verse 11. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." This current story in Acts chapter 25 is one of Paul being abandoned, of being rejected. It seems to be a story of despair, maybe even enough for Paul to give up. But the great news is that there is a bigger picture. There is a larger story. God is sending Paul to Rome to preach, to teach his word in Rome, to spread his gospel. And how would he get there? How would this happen? By being put on trial. By being at the very point of his own death. I appeal to Caesar. Appealing to human hands. These human hands seemingly controlling Paul's destiny. The reply comes, "To Caesar you will go." Festus is carrying out God's plan. What's going on? God knows what he's doing. God works in incredible ways. Those things you might look at in your life and say, they're mistakes, they're mishaps, they're just wrong. They're so desperate, those situations. Things are totally out of control. God is doing his purpose. Injustice, suffering, that mess that is your life. God is sovereign. He is working out his divine purpose. It may well be that some of you tonight are stuck in Acts chapter 25. That might be where your life is right now. Abandoned, rejected, alone, condemned, judged, feeling, I just want to give up. Just remember this. We are only in the middle of our stories. Some of us have got a few more chapters to go than others, probably. But we're not at the end. But the great news is that you do know the end of the story. As Daff reminded us this morning, we have that great privilege of knowing Jesus, of being able to be taught Jesus Christ. We have that great hope that we can cling to, the promise that there is a glorious end. That one day we will be face to face with Jesus Christ. He will bring us through. And there may be some things that you'll never see in this life. You'll never understand. You'll never work out why. What's going on? But our story is God's story. His bigger story. He is in control. He is working his purpose out. So please be amazed at what God is doing. Be amazed at what God can do. Be amazed at what God will do. Cling to that hope. Cling to that promise. God is not finished yet. You may be looking at our world, and all you can see is terror winning. You may look at your own life, and all you can see is hardship. You may look at everything and just think, it's time to give up. What is going on? God is not finished yet. And how do we know this? I wonder, as I was talking about Paul, I hope your minds might have been going to someone else. I said that Paul was abandoned. I said that Paul was falsely accused. I said that Paul was judged by human hands. As he hung upon the cross, the Lord Jesus shouted out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" As Jesus stood before the Sanhedrin, people made up all sorts of things about him. False accusations were thrown at him, one after the other. And as Jesus stood before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor knew he was innocent. His fate in some ways seemed to be in his hands. And yet Pilate hands him over to be crucified. What is going on? It seemed like total despair. The cross seems the most desperate picture imaginable. Has God given up? Has Jesus given up? Is it all over? God's sovereign plan was being worked out. What looked like despair was glory. God was in control. It may be that you are not a Christian yet. I strongly urge you to think carefully about this last week. Look at our world. Look what is going on. Can you make sense of it? I would strongly argue to you, without God, it makes no sense. What is going on? And many people's conclusions would be, time to give up. It's over. It's done. I think this week speaks so strongly that there must be something else. There must be someone who is in ultimate control. If not, there is a God who has a plan. You may not be able to see it for what it is at the moment. You may be really feeling it in your life. But God has a bigger picture. There is hope. There is a glorious hope that we cling to. So do we give up? Do we pack it all in and say, what is going on? The story is not finished. And yet we know the ending. And it's glorious. Can I urge you? Pray for enough strength for today so that you can face tomorrow and one day reach that glorious hope that is promised. Let's pray. Lord, it all seemed wrong and doomed for Paul. And yet you had a glorious plan. Father, it may be that our lives just seem a mess. It may be that we are screaming from our lungs, what is going on? Lord, please reveal your plan to us tonight. Show us that glorious hope. Help us to remember that you are in control and that one day we can be with you. Lord, you know the end of the story, and it's glorious. Remind us of that now, I pray.